Hello, everyone. I think we are good to go. Good morning to everyone who is here in North America. Good afternoon to our European participants. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the second panel in our three-panel series on provocation and challenge, populism and neo-fascism in transnational contexts. And this second panel is titled State and Vernacular Far-Right Media Campaigns, Networks and Movements. At the beginning of this event, I would like to acknowledge that Carleton University, which is running and organizing this series, is located on the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. The peoples of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation have lived on this territory since time immemorial, and their culture and presence have nurtured and continued to nurture this land. In acknowledging that we are meeting on the traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation, we also recognize the historical oppression and dispossession of indigenous peoples in what is now Canada. At the beginning of this event, I would like to turn over the floor to Jennifer Evans, who is the organizer of this panel series, and she will introduce both this series as a whole, this particular panel, and also tell us a little bit about all the various institutions that have sponsored this event.
Thanks, Achim. Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for attending today. My name is Jennifer Evans, as Achim mentioned, and I teach in the history department here at Carleton University. And I'm really pleased to welcome you to the second of 3 roundtables in our series, which looks at national and transnational far-right and populist networks and actors. The first panel took place a few weeks ago, and it looked at the history of German and Canadian far-right groups in what we might call the analog era, the pre-internet age. And today's panel will shift the focus to the present day. We have a third panel in November that showcases the work of 3 organizations in the Netherlands and Germany and Canada that are doing rubber meets the road anti-hate work with civil society. Information about the third panel and how to register will be posted or is posted in the chat. This series forms part of a larger research project I'm facilitating here at Carleton known as Triangular Hate. It looks at networked communication and historical memory activism in social media between Germany, the US, and Canada. It includes colleagues here at Carleton, Sven Steinberg and David Yusva Clement, and a team of student researchers. It's supported by the Department of Canadian Heritage and runs parallel to another project known as Populist Publics, sponsored by the Social Science Humanities Research Council, which I oversee with Sandra Robinson in Media and Communications. And I'll put some links in the chat if folks are interested. Before we begin, and I would like to thank the organizations that have made these events possible through their generous support and funding. We are very pleased to be working together with the German Embassy in Ottawa and Ambassador Sparwasser in particular, the Center for European Studies and the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence here at Carleton, the Department of Canadian Heritage, the Social Science Historical Research Council of Canada, and the Department of History and Institute for European and Russian Studies. I'm going to turn things back to Achim, who will introduce the speakers to today's panel, and I wish you a great conversation.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. So again, the panel is actually a large panel with 6 speakers, speaking all from their perspectives on this topic of state and vernacular far-right media campaigns, networks, and movements. I will at this moment only briefly mention the names of the speakers, and before they present, I will give a slightly more detailed introduction of each speaker. So we have, as I mentioned, 6 speakers, and in the order of the program, the first speaker will be Danielle Carron from Carleton University, followed by Brendan Rigato, who is also here at Carleton University. Third speaker is Andrea Pető from Central European University, followed by Jan Grabowski from the University of Ottawa, of Cristian Norocel from Lund University in Sweden, and finally Dagmar Ellerbrock from Technical University of Dresden. So that is the program. They will each speak for about 8 minutes or so. After that, I will moderate a bit of a conversation between our panelists before we open up the floor to questions from the audience. These questions can be asked in the Q&A box, which you should see at the bottom of your screen. You can ask questions in English or in French. Maybe we can also take a few other languages. I think we have other language competence here as well to translate. So please don't hesitate to put your questions into the Q&A box, and we will have the panelists address them. So let's get started. As I mentioned, the first speaker is Danielle Carron. She's an MA candidate in history at Carleton University, and her research interests include the intersections of nationalism and sexuality in German and Canadian contemporary mass media. Danielle, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. My name is Danny, and I'm an MA candidate at Carleton University in the history department. As a research assistant on the Populist Publics project, I'm responsible for gathering data within far-right Canadian Instagram accounts. And Instagram offers significant insights into far-right digital world building through what is primarily visual-based content. So the focus of our project is how social media users engage with and utilize Canadian history and heritage. And today I will be exploring the very Eurocentric and transnational elements of this particular engagement. Also, as a timely example of the real-world implications of transnational far-right imaginaries, I will be discussing the 2020 media investigation of the so-called Nazi colony in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, and its narrative parallels to the Canadian far-right. So to provide some necessary context for Canadian far-right spaces in social media, I provided a basic categorization of the kinds of Instagram accounts that I found over the past year. There's, of course, some overlap between these accounts, and they interact in a variety of ways. For example, content produced by popular far-right news outlets is often screenshot and shared across a variety of accounts, including conspiracy theorists and student movements. In turn, humorous content or memes produced or reposted on these accounts is often shared among political commentators and personal users, and aesthetic posts promoting what they consider to be white Canadian heritage are shared amongst vintage and province-specific accounts. In this way, Canadian far-right Instagram networks have created a reinforced space for building a nationalistic imaginary in which a particular version of Canada, one mostly based on racialized notions of history and culture, can exist. So it is through this particular interest in Canadian history that far-right Instagram users begin to evoke a transnational idea of belonging, superiority, and cultural and political identity. This engagement could be characterized as pro-heritage, but anti-history, meaning that it celebrates select aspects of traditional connections between white Canadians and Europe, while rejecting what they consider to be forcibly leftist historical narratives, such as a reckoning with colonialism or even post-fascist memory. This emerges in a number of formats, as seen in these examples. On the left, content from a student group promotes a European Canada, and below them, a student-run meme account celebrates what they call Mussolini Mondays. In the center, a vintage account shares an advertisement from the early 20th century promoting white settlerism in Canada, while below that, a Quebec-based account creates a vibrant edit to commemorate the death of Napoleon. And on the right, we see a meme expressing preference for European immigration. In the top right corner, we see a particular example of these kinds of accounts. It is the Canadian iteration of a Holy Europe account, which is a self-described alliance of patriotic parallel movements of Europeans. This reverence for European history and heritage, seen throughout Canadian far-right Instagram, both humorous and sincere, does not undermine these users' apparent Canadian nationalisms. On the contrary, connecting to Europe in this way is considered appropriate, as it reinforces their racial notions of Canadian belonging and sends a message to whom they consider the legitimate curators of Canadian culture and identity, which is white settlers. In some instances, an interest in historical revisionism and even conspiracy theories makes these calls to Europe even more explicit. Canadian users share the anxieties of Europe's far right with their belief in the Great Replacement, a conspiracy theory originating with French author Renaud Camus, in which invasive immigrant forces threaten to diminish the white race and European culture. In Canada, as seen as in the infographic on the bottom left, this manifests in similar demographic fears, as well as a need to protect Canadian nationhood and identity as a natural extension of Europe. Anti-Semitism and anti-globalism are also common among Canadian accounts, as seen in the top right. This meme justifies the existence of the Nazi Third Reich by comparing it to other European colonies and empires, while the comment that I've highlighted in orange laments the outcome of the Second World War, expressing a desire for the beauty of German culture over the perceived Jewish global conspiracy. In the far right's definition, this distorted historical Europe provides the racial, cultural, and political sanctum to their modern crises. And from the perspective of some of Germany's far right, Canada could serve the same purpose, as I will explain. So, in July 2020, an investigative article published by Der Spiegel claimed that former German news anchor Eva Herrmann and her partner, far-right conspiracy theorist Andreas Popp, were attempting to establish a like-minded colony of German immigrants in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia. Popp and Herrmann hosted annual Canada-based seminars in which they shared their ideologies, among them climate change denial and fears of migrant invasions, after which German attendees were encouraged to purchase local property. Frank Eckert, who was formerly Popp's business partner, but no longer affiliated, was said to be running his own real estate scheme targeting Germans, through which he reportedly shared Holocaust denial content and his sympathies for Reichsbürger movement with potential clients. In their websites and media content, Eckert, Popp, and Herrmann all conceptualized Cape Breton as a safe refuge for ideological minorities from a doomed Europe, in which Canadian land ownership offers the ticket to self-reliance and community building. This evokes historical narratives of European entitlement to settler colonies in North America. In a 2016 journal article, Patricia Simpson discusses Popp and Herrmann as part of a larger phenomenon of self-credentializing online-based European far-right. And Popp and Herrmann's engagement with Canada offers an insightful window into German far-right self-identification in historical, racial, and national narratives. Not only does Popp refuse to be labeled an immigrant to Canada, he and Herrmann have also created, well, they've co-opted indigeneity into their schemes of colony building. Meetings with Indigenous persons have been integrated into their annual seminars, and in a 2015 video promoting his home in Cape Breton, Popp describes how his audience of free thinkers is stimulated by the energy of a country that, quote, still has Indians. On Herrmann's own website, a 2021 post about the Canadian Red Dress Project, which raises awareness for missing and murdered Indigenous women, uses the history of colonialism as a cautionary tale for Europe, where she implies that assaults against European white women by mostly Middle Eastern immigrants will soon require Germany to have its own red dress installations. This co-option of a narrative of indigeneity thus serves not only to legitimize their roots to Canada and their need to build a community here, but supports their larger xenophobic and anti-immigration views. As Simpson describes, the identification with First Nations invokes Germans' love of author Karl May, but also a mythos of a vanishing race. And interestingly enough, a 2020 Canadian opinion piece reinforced this narrative as well, as the Canadian commentator pointed out that they were likely chasing a Karl May-inspired Cape Breton dream. So, in conclusion, similarly constructed imaginaries and the shared value systems they imply pave the way for transnational movements of ideas and their agents. In the case of broader calls to xenophobic and racist pan-Europeanism within the digital sphere, national borders are made essentially obsolete. The West becomes an emblematic ideal worthy of holistic protection on formal and informal fronts. In this way, everyday activities such as engagement with Canadian far-right Instagram networks are placed on the same continuum as these structured transnational exchanges and efforts, including Andreas Popp's seminars, but also political campaigns and the sharing of organizational structures. Brandon, whose presentation is next, will be sharing his research into an example of this with Canada's branch of Pegida. And yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Danielle. And you have already almost done my job. So as you mentioned, Brandon Rigato is our next speaker. Brandon is a PhD candidate in communication studies in the School of Journalism and Communication here at Carleton. His focus is on right-wing extremism, radicalization, and social movement. He is a senior research assistant with the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council supported project Populist Publics, which Jennifer mentioned earlier. And he is a co-author of the 60 Days of PVE campaign, Lessons on Organizing an Online Peer-to-Peer Counter-Radicalization Program, which appeared in 2017 in the Journal for De-Radicalization. So Brandon, the floor is yours.
Thank you for that kind introduction. So my presentation is going to provide a snapshot of a section of my PhD dissertation. My work focuses exclusively on how right-wing extremist movements that are established outside of Canada become repurposed and rebranded for a Canadian audience. So I'm going to provide a very brief history of Pegida in Germany and Pegida in Canada. Ultimately, I will conclude by showing a digital network graph that demonstrates the connections between the various Pegida Facebook pages as I captured them in 2019 to demonstrate how widespread one Facebook page's networks can be. Oh, sorry, skipped over my outline there. So Pegida Germany roughly translates to patriotic Europeans against the Islamization of the West. It was established by Lutz Bachmann in Dresden, Germany in 2014. You can see him on the left here with, quote unquote, Hitler mustache. And the original caption of the photo that he posted said, "Guess who's back?" And this was a sort of an attempt at humor from him, supposedly. Bachmann claims to have founded the group in response to witnessing a demonstration in Dresden that advocated on behalf of the PKK and the Kurdish people in their war against Daesh. By Bachmann's own admission, he was troubled by Islamic problems making their way into countries like Germany, which motivated him to create Pegida on Facebook. So this main Pegida page generated a great deal of traction with a variety of supporters such as nationalists, open racists, hooligans, and the Hogeza crowd. This broad support for Pegida led to 100,000 plus online followers, both domestically and internationally within Germany, and the establishment of variations of the Pegida brand, such as Pegida Canada, UK, USA, Europe, and many others. So it was an incredibly fast-growing movement that was established using a basic social media platform that's open to all, which is Facebook. So now we segue to Pegida Canada. Inspired by the success and the message of Pegida, the Canadian version, Pegida Canada, was established on January 13th, 2015. The leader or creator of this page never publicly declared who they were, and I don't want to speculate. So the Pegida Canada Facebook page writes that they adopted the Pegida acronym to show solidarity with the German movement and to express their fear of Islamization of Western cultures, Sharia law, the introduction of halal foods and Islamic clothing being openly adorned, which they viewed as eroding Canadian and Western values. Unlike the Germans' Pegida supporters, Pegida Canada is much smaller, as you can see in the protest photos they have here, which I believe was in London, Ontario. And their Facebook page tends to be more of a place to share memes, as you can see on the right here, where they're mocking men that aren't fighting ISIS the way the Kurdish women are. So now the social network graph, which was from 2019, and it demonstrates that there are multiple Canadian chapters of Pegida, which as we can see there in red. We have Pegida Canada BC, Alberta, and the main hub, which is Canada. We also see that there are numerous other Pegida pages that are connected to, such as France, Scotland, Europe, USA, a variety of German cities with branches in Bayern, Hamburg, Berlin, among many others. But we also see a connection to German and European politicians and figures that Pegida are connected to, such as Bjorn Hawk, Dr. Christina Baum, Michael Sturzenberger, Heiko Hessenkemper, Jens Mayer, Wesitz Bachmann, and Matteo Salvini, plus political parties that are established, such as the AfD. And I'm sorry for my pronunciation there. So most of the content being connected with by Pegida Canada and other Pegida pages and other like movements that will share the same views and concerns, like Ein Prozent für Unserland. So what we are able to witness with this basic graph that was taken from Facebook is how far-right domestic concerns within Germany and perhaps domestic Canadian concerns are able to speak back to one another using one platform. So going forward, when we begin to think about multiple platforms, we could see how easy it is for these ideas and bigoted movements to spread and communicate with one another. I think I'm within my time limit. For that, thank you very much for listening to me.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Brandon. Absolutely within your time limit. So that brings us then to our third speaker, Andrea Pető, who is a historian and professor in the Department of Gender Studies at Central European University in Vienna, Austria. She's also a research affiliate of the CEU Democracy Institute in Budapest and a Doctor of Science of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. Recent publications include The Women of the Arrow Cross Party, Invisible Hungarian Perpetrators in the Second World War, published with Palgrave in 2020, and Forgotten Massacre, Budapest 1944, published in 2021 with De Gruyter. Andrea, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm extremely honored to be a part of this fantastic panel, which is addressing so many important issues. Can you hear me well? Okay, fantastic. So what I would like to talk about today is a part of the communication which is usually escapes the analysis, and that is the networks and communications of far-right illiberal scientific policy and science policy. So what I will present today will hopefully come out in the Berichte zur Wissenschaftsgeschichte, this prestigious German special journal, a special issue about the academic authorization. So I wrote it up and I hope I will be in 8 minutes. So Tucker Carlson, the face of the pro-Trump US media, made a visit Hungary for a considerable fee, as he charges $70,000 for one public appearance. Even he, a very experienced US media personality, confessed about his overseas summer trip that, I quote him, "This is by far the weirdest thing I ever done," end quote. The institution which invited Tucker Carlson was the Matthias Corvinus College, and I will use in this talk the abbreviation MCC, right? Which was founded in 1996 in Budapest by one of the Fidesz, this is the governing party in Hungary, oligarchs, during the left liberal government. This founding member of Fidesz was deeply disappointed by his party's electoral loss in 1994 to the former Communist Party. Therefore, he decided to use the wealth he accumulated in the previous years to prepare for the next elections. So his idea was to copy the very successful educational system of colleges of advanced studies. Today, none of the 16 young or the most middle-aged all-male faculty listed on the MCC's flashy webpage has produced any considerable academic publication or earned distinction, or even has an age index higher than 1. The list of faculty, with its very low level of academic authorization, invited Tucker Carlson and also hired the former Technical University Dresden faculty Werner Patzelt, who was fired because of his connection to Pegida. By 2020, the MCC was receiving exactly as much state financial support as the whole Hungarian higher education, and has an endowment which is rivaling only with the University of Oxford. The MCC is just one example of the institutions that are actually flourishing in Hungary, but also in other illiberal countries, which are at the first glance look like scholarly institutions, but in fact, they are creating a transnational network of illiberal politicians and knowledge producers. MCC started as a small elite educational institution, which was transformed into a flagship of illiberal science policy. So using the example of this extremely rich institution, I would like to unpack how and why the illiberal governments are setting up these quasi-scientific institutions. And I argue that this is a new form of scientific communication. George Mossy, in his oft-quoted Masses and Men, described fascism as, I quote, an amoeba-like absorption of ideas from the mainstream of popular thought and culture, countered by the urge towards activism and taming, end quote, along with ruthless dismantling of the liberal parliamentary order. Here he was referring to the inadequate political response to radicalization of the mainstream in the interwar Europe. For the past decades, political scientists and also experts of communication and historians have at great length discussed terminology that helps us to understand the recent developments in countries as different as Hungary, Poland, Serbia, Slovenia, Brazil, US, and Turkey. Mafia state, hybrid state, autocratic legalism, constitutional authoritarianism. With Veronika Grabowska, we call these states illiberal polypore state, based on their common modus operandi. This polypore, before you start Googling, is a parasitic pore fungus that lives on a wood and produces nothing but more polypores, more mushrooms. And unlike political scientists who admire the effectiveness of these states, we argue that these polypore states do not have original ideas. Rather, they take ideas of others and use them for their own purpose. Self-maintenance. Just think about the amoeba of Mossy. Past authoritarian regimes took over already existing scientific institutions, like in the case of the MCC, and transformed them into explicitly ideological institutions. So I argue against perceiving illiberalism as a revival of authoritarianism or calling it fascist, and instead favor seeing in a new form of governance founded on and instrumentalizing previous democratic concepts and institutions, one that can be better understood by going beyond the routine comparative analysis of political systems along East-West divide, to instead trace gradual socio-political developments in these countries and position them in the context of broader processes. Post-communist democracies have their own socio-historical legacies, and the fact that illiberal tendencies extend through Europe suggests that they should rather be viewed as a local symptoms of failures of the European neoliberal democratic project. In terms of modus operandi, these illiberal regimes can be understood by this metaphor of the polypore state. And this polyporism involves exploitation and appropriation of various aspects of the European liberal democratic project, institutions like universities, procedures, concepts, and funding opportunities. And it also involves that liberal regimes divestiture of resources from those it regards as beneficiaries of the so-called corrupt liberal post-communist system, like the already existing human rights and civil society sector, in order to transfer those resources to its own base, securing it and enlarging it. Unlike Mossy's amoeba, which has existence and economy of its own, the polypore usually attacks already damaged trees. Hence, illiberal forces typically rise to power in the context of weak institutions, weak and divided progressive parties, and failing democratic projects. In the case of science policies and science communication, an already weakened and underfunded higher education and research infrastructure is an easy prey for illiberal forces. The polypore state incorporates far-right extremism to legitimize and maintain the very existence of the polypore, whose only source of life, food and energy and the ideas are coming from the stem from tree under the attack. So in this article I mentioned, in Veronika Grabowska, we define three characteristics of this polyporism. One is the familialism. So this is not family policy, but familialism. And I don't need to go into details because maybe Cristian will talk about the anti-gender attacks, the security discourses, namely that everything is an issue of threat and attack. And for a long time, scientists and academics found themselves as labeled to be the enemies of the nation. And the third one, which is very important for today's discussion, is the founding and funding new research and teaching institutions bearing the same profile as the already existing ones, like in the case of the MCC. So creating this kind of mirror institutions. The difficulty lies in understanding the rise of illiberal science policy, as it is a twofold case study in both polypore illiberal government control, state capture, and neoliberal marketization of higher education. In the European context, the main actors used to be state-financed actors. However, the neoliberalization of academia has opened scientific knowledge production up to corporations, which are interested solely in their own profit, as it is also true in illiberal actors. So this combination of state capture and profit making for the few also makes this unique and deeply influential situation with long-lasting consequences for creation, protection, and transfer of academic authority. To conclude, following the developments in Hungary and other, taking over science by illiberal states, it happened without considerable resistance, except few mass demonstrations like supporting CEU when CEU was expelled from Hungary, and there were more than 80,000 demonstrators on the street. So at the moment, the concept educated acquiescence, which is a term constructed to describe the reaction of intellectuals in China for the communist control, offers more benefits for the intellectuals and the academics than the resistance. Therefore, the crucial question is what the representatives of the polypore institutions will meet with: appeasement in the scientific context, once they bring lavish financial support into the proposed cooperation, or rejection and despair. If the latter is the case, then the polypore will quite possibly infect other institutions with its Machiavellian approach to value and morals sooner rather than later. That's why mapping the modus operandi, like parallel institution building, familialism, and securitization of science policy in illiberal states is helpful. It explains why and how these institutions mask political authority as academic authority. The process leaves no space for independence or free thinking, even though at first sight, academic institutions and authorization system look like those like in any other country, but this is not the case. But once the essence and the content of academic research are removed, these institutions present the onlooker with only hollow copies of academic institutions, like those shown in the case of the MCC, which operates under academic authorization that is neither academic nor authorization. And this is an important lesson for higher educational institutions in Europe and beyond. And it is not a surprise that Carson called his visit to Hungary his so-called weirdest experience of his life. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrea. And that brings us to our fourth speaker, Jan Grabowski, who is a professor of history at the University of Ottawa and a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. His interests focus on the Holocaust in Poland and more specifically on relations between Jews and Poles during the war. His book, Hunt for the Jews, has been awarded the Yad Vashem International Book Prize in 2014, and he's currently studying the open ghettos in Poland during the Holocaust. Yeah, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this invitation. Can you hear me? Fine. Okay. So it's most of all, I'm delighted to be able to visit my neighbors at Carleton from across, let's say, the city, although I am speaking from Poland right now. In any case, I'll be very brief. I only have 8 minutes, so let me speed it up. I will, in part here, tie my little talk to Andrea Pető's talk, because we are talking about, both of us, about state-sponsored, let's say, attack on scholarship and on academia. In my case, I was asked to, and I thought it would be most interesting to share my perspective, which is both as someone who studies a populist attack on history and someone who is an object of an attack of a populist state or authoritarian state. In any case, very briefly, as Achim mentioned, most of my scholarly life, I was studying the issue of Polish-Jewish relations during the war, more specifically during the Holocaust. Why this particular topic became such a hot button? Well, to be honest, in Polish, let's say, context, there are many hot buttons and hot potatoes. However, this one is the only one with broad international, let's say, implications. Therefore, Polish authorities are hypersensitive towards everything and anything they consider as, let's say, causing possible damage on international scale seen. Therefore, each and every study which basically portrays or sheds light on less rosy aspects of Polish society, attitudes towards the Jews during World War II, will be confronted, especially during last 6 years since ultra-nationalist government came to power. So there is obsession with history, and history is at the center of it. I'll briefly share a screen here so you can perhaps relate better to it. Just very briefly, a few of these pictures. Okay, there is a number of institutions which have been created in Poland. One of them, Institute of National Remembrance, actually has a budget of annual budget of over $100 million with huge crew of historians, or rather employees of the state with historical diplomas. Now these institutions are now gearing towards, let's say, assaulting independent scholars. They do it without much, let's say, sophistication, but with a lot of means at their disposal. Just to show you the way these things are working and how institutional culture can work in Poland at this stage, in front of you is the director appointed, Mr. Dr. Greniuch, appointed director of the second largest branch of the Institute of National Remembrance, here raising his right arm in Hitlergruß. He was recalled after tremendous pressure, but the institutional culture which allowed him to be appointed speaks for itself. Now, the second part is the thrust is that historians like myself have to contend with the power of the state. It is not, let's say, right-wing cooks and strange people. It is power of a powerful state that's now directed through proxies, such as government-funded newspapers. You You can see here my humble self gracing the title page. The title goes lie without punishment. I could multiply these examples, but if you want to see how you can inspire hate against academics or anyone else for that matter, well, that's what they do. Also, chain one of Polish TV, splashing faces of myself and my colleagues with comments which are derogatory to say the least, plus a number of so-called gongos, an expression for which I am grateful to Andrea Pető, who taught me this. And so government funded or inspired NGOs or NGOs which pretend to be non-governmental. Here you have some of them. So here, let me stop sharing and go back to the screen. So the situation, as you can see, is dynamic, and the state uses it, flexes its muscle, and in 2018, as you know, in January, there is the so-called Polish Holocaust law, which basically stipulated that anyone who claims that Polish nation had as an involvement in the Holocaust will be facing 3 years in prison. Later on, under tremendous pressure, Polish government was forced to withdraw these provisions, but they said instead, we will go with civil litigation. And here, very briefly, to tell you, I am co-author and editor of a huge study which found itself at the center of a cyclone with the might of the Polish state-directed attacks acting through NGOs, the gongos I have just mentioned. They filed a lawsuit which took 2 years to resolve, and I wouldn't even talk about this, but the important part is that you could see through this civil litigation where the nationalists wanted to go, and where they wanted to go, and they nearly arrived because they won the first round, and they assured they wanted to make certain through the courts that historians cannot say certain things if that historians would have no right to evaluate the credibility of historical sources. And the Warsaw Court actually agreed that would be possibly an end to independent historical research in Poland. Second, the Warsaw Court declared that actually a Polish nation had a right to national pride, and each and every book or statement which countervened or went against this assertion that Poles were innocent of all wrongdoings during the war could face a civil lawsuit, which of course would also mean an end to these pursuits. So in any case, a two-pronged attack. On the one hand, you have so-called character assassination. On the other, you have civil litigation. And in the background, you have also criminal charges which have been filed against two of my colleagues. And I am now being informed that they are entertained against me as we speak. And so there is this huge pressure, and hopefully we won. I and my colleague who was co-accused, we won on appeal in Warsaw Court, but this is of course just the beginning, because for these states, like Polish state now, the falsification of history or the, let's say, domination of historical narrative is very central to their idea of who they are and how they can mobilize their electorate. And I believe I arrived at my 8 minutes, so thank you very much.
Wow, that was perfect timing. So thank you very much, Jan. That brings us to Cristian Norocel for our next presentation. Cristian is Associate Senior Lecturer in the Department of Gender Studies at Lund University in Sweden. He applies an intersectional lens to the study of digital and real-life mobilization of far-right entities and radical right populist parties across Europe. And in his most recent co-authored article, he examines the imbrication of gender and religion in Nordic radical right populism. Cristian, please.
Je veux commencer en français avec vous remercier à les organisatrices et les organisateurs de ces événements pour l'invitation à cette table ronde. Et pour continuer en anglais, because I am, as you notice, much more confident in my English skills than in my French, but for the sake of this event, yes, Canada being a bilingual country is always very important to underline these aspects. For the brief intervention that I will be having today, I would like to weigh in some of the previous observations of my previous speakers and shed some light on the a few key elements when it comes to the far-right mobilization, when in terms of networks and movements, which have enabled these elements to thrive in situations of crisis. So for this speech, I will focus very, very briefly on what we can say they are key events in the recent history across the world, with a focus, of course, on the European context. And these are the financial crisis, yes, in the late 2000s, on the humanitarian crisis from 2015, and last but not least, on the ongoing health crisis. I'm trying to do this by focusing on the so-called Web 2.0 socio-technical affordances. What does it mean? That I'm interested in looking at the interaction between various entities on the far right, if you wish, ecosystem, when it comes to how these social media technologies are used both as sources for ideological production as well as for dissemination and confirmation of support, and also the creation of what I deem to be a rather masculine digital community. Yes, so in here you can see that I have my gender interest in the matter, and I approach the subject from a political science perspective. So as I focus both on Eastern Europe and Northern Europe, I will try to pick up a few examples from Sweden, respectively, Romania. They are very different contexts, but for the sake of this illustration, I would like to bring these two cases to the fore. What is interesting is that in the case of Sweden, Sweden has played a very particular role in the mobilization of the far-right environment, both as a place that traditionally had been acting as a nexus for transnational mobilization of far-right elements, yes, serving as some sort of a bridgehead in Europe between the American mobilization on the far right and its European counterparts, yeah, and nowadays we see that it's very effervescently trying to drive this English language mobilization in the European context. Yeah, so we see how the identitarian movement is getting a lot of traction via various think tanks. And in here, I'm thinking also what Andrea was mentioning earlier. It's not yet a state-endorsed thing, but there are all these far-right elements that they're trying to come with their own think tanks and with their own meta-political institutes that they try to craft a new version of how the world could look like. And the memes in here are very important. So I saw that, you know, several of my previous speakers have mentioned this issue. Irony is very important for far-right mobilization. What happened in this context, and why I was saying that it's very important to keep an eye on the gender aspect, is because these environments are mainly and they are dominated by men, but not only because you have a lot of men joining these movements, but also because they promote a highly masculine version of politics. Yes, so what we see in, for instance, such political entities such as Nordiska motståndsrörelsen or Alternativ för Sverige is exactly this effort of taking over the mainstream political scene and trying to flip it into a far right and radical right tendency. Of course, there is also already a right-wing populist party that is present in the Swedish parliament, Sverigedemokraterna, and they already represent the third largest party in Swedish politics, for example. The other two parties that I have mentioned earlier, they are not as strong. I mean, in the latest elections, they barely registered some support. 0.3 was the largest that they could gather. However, what they try to push in the context of the crisis is exactly this idea of demographic anxieties and trying to flip the image of Sweden from a country that was, as I said previously, seen as a nexus for far-right radicalization, as a country that is suffering the most in the European context at the cost, the very tangible cost of this demographic race and this demographic anxiety. And to take you very, very quickly, because I have just a few more minutes at my disposal, to the Romanian context. So in the far east of the European Union, what happens in this context is we see a political force, which is called the Alianța pentru Unirea Românilor, AUR, so the Alliance for the Unification of Romanians, which is built, as Andrea was mentioning earlier, on the basis of a coalition for family, so the same retrogressive conservative movement that had pushed for the referendum, the so-called referendum for family in Romania, that failed. So that organization later on morphed into a political vehicle, and we saw this our political entity that is interestingly using its media campaigning as a way of getting access into the mainstream politics. Now they are in the Romanian parliament, and they are registered something over 9% in electoral support. And interestingly, is that their media campaign was very much focused on social media, as well as, and in a manner similar to how previous iterations of far-right political vehicles in Romania were using, for instance, in the early 90s, they were using their own newspaper. And here I have in mind the Greater Romania Party, or later on in the early 2000s, using their own TV station. And here I have in mind the party, Party for the People, Dan Diaconescu thing. And in this context, I would like to sum up now, because I am very, very quick to finish. What is interesting in this context is we see how crises are offering a environment in which these parties are not only developing, but are actually thriving and successfully mobilizing support for their political agenda by resorting to this elements. And in here, as I said, because the presentation was rather brief and I'm soon to finish, I could not focus on too many things, but hopefully in the Q&A session, I'll be able to develop things. So thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Cristian. And then our final speaker is Dagmar Ellerbrock. She is chair of modern history at Technical University Dresden. She was principal investigator and founding member of the Collaborative Research Center 1285 on Invectivität between 2018 and 2019. She was also the Hannah Arendt Chair at the Munk School, University of Toronto. And her main areas of research are democratization, violence research, and the history of emotions. Dagmar.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for a very interesting panel. And I guess my talk very nicely links to some of the inputs we already heard. As you heard, I'm one of the founding member of a common research center developing an analytical framework we call Invectivity. And we think it is a useful framework to understand populist movements. And in the next few minutes, I will very briefly introduce you to this framework and walk you through the key elements and try to demonstrate what we can gain by using this framework. You are all familiar with shaming as basic populist mode of communication. And the question is, why do populists use this pattern of communication? That's easy to understand if we remember that one important effect of shaming is isolation on the one hand, and forming groups and forming movements and mobilization on the other hand. Research considers shame as the most social feeling, and since it is always related to others, shame is essential for forming social groups and for organizing social orders. So it's a very important emotion in a social way. Now, talking about invectivity is not talking about shaming or insults, but it is talking about a dynamic. And I'm going to try to explain how this dynamic starts and what is fueling this kind of dynamic. The first important element to understand this dynamic is the triad. Invective communication is always based on three parties. There's somebody insulting a person, there is a person getting insulted, and then there are bystanders. And these bystanders are very important because they are essential for speeding up the dynamic, for speeding up the communication, and important for integrating the bystander into the communication circle are emotions. And these emotions are produced by shaming communication, insulting communication, because nobody stays cool when getting insulted or seeing somebody gets insulted. There are always emotions and affects involved, and these emotions draw the bystander into the communication. The second element that's crucial are, as we already heard, the media. And the media became an actor in this invective triad because the media can be seen as a kind of virtual bystander, and they observe what's going on, they analyze what's going on, but they very soon become part of the invective communication. And what's probably most important, they are able to transfer a locally based insult, a locally based shaming over time, and spread it in different parts of the world. So these parts are crucial to understand the invective dynamic, and I'm now going to apply this concept to an historical framework in order to demonstrate what we can learn by it. I would like to use an example from the first democracy, the Weimar Republic, and probably you have come across one of the famous politicians, Matthias Erzberg. He was a conservative politician. He was Secretary of Finance, the one who installed the German tax system we are still relying on. But most important is he signed the peace treaty of Versailles that ended the First World War. And as you also probably know, after the end of the First World War, there was a huge debate in Germany why the German army lost the war. And there were very loud voices from the right-wing movements who claimed that the German soldiers never had been defeated on the battleground, but that they had been betrayed by German politicians. And that was the so-called stab in the back myth. They had been stabbed in the back by German politicians, and especially by the ones who negotiated and signed the peace treaty. And one of these politicians, as I said, was Matthias Erzberg. So he was one of the prominent targeters of insulting campaigns. And one shaming campaign was so serious that Erzberger felt that he had to go to court in order to save his face. And that's very typical for insulting and shaming campaigns, that people have the feeling they cannot get out of it, and they have to fight it. They have to get involved into this circle. So Erzberger decided to move to court. And that was exactly what Karl Helfrich, a right-wing politician who started these campaigns, wanted him to do. So that was really a strategic action. He provoked Erzberger until he finally went to court. And at the same time, Helfrich started a media campaign. And this media campaign was orchestrated in a very strategical way and went parallel to the lawsuit. So Erzberger had to fight two battle lines, one in the court and one on the media stage. And he finally won and we have these invective loops because Helferich published these insults every week. So it was an ongoing process. Erzberger, in the end, won the libel suit, but he lost the public battle, especially because these insult campaigns provoked several terroristic attacks. He survived the first assassination in 1920, but he was killed by a following up assassination in 1921. And one of the murderer of Matthias Erzberg later testified that this campaign, Fort mit Erzberger, Away with Erzberg, he interpreted as a provocation to start this terroristic campaign, this murdering campaign. So one can say that the escalation of invective communication very often turns into violent pattern, into violent interaction, and that this kind of shaming, insulting, and hate communication in many cases is a kind of prelude, a kind of beginning of physical violence. And that was true for the Weimar Republic, but it is also true for the dynamics of today, as some of you know, and maybe have seen, oh, I'm looking for my, sorry. There was a, here you see it in the downstairs, there were some attacks and assassination against German politicians, and here we have the same dynamic. We see the same kind of logic, that we have right-wing campaigns, press campaigns, social media campaigns, and they translate into violent acting. So to sum it up, it is important to take the emotions into account, because the emotional pattern, the emotional regime is very crucial in order to understand this dynamic. We have to be aware that hate speech is a form of violence, has destabilizing effects, and later on very often translates into physical violence. And the final point is that these communication loops and emotions are essential. And these communication loops do take place in various contexts, in the scientific context, on social media, in the political room. And we as scientists and also as civilians are part of this communication loop. So this gives us an opportunity to interfere and to interact and to direct these communication loops into different directions. Thanks a lot.